you. The title of their presentation is Horror Movies and Their Effect on Physical Disabilities. Just going to introduce the next person. After that, Marie Saylor is our next person, and the title of Marie's presentation is Girls Just Want to Be Boys, Fan Fiction as a Tool for Women's Liberation. And then our last presenter, Monica Sauer, The Representation We Want, on the topic of queer YA fiction and the issue of quality in a growing genre. So each of those presentations, their PowerPoints are on this laptop, and I will pop those up here. And we're good to go.
I'm not used to using this computer. Apologies.
Oh, and I'm gonna, I have the screen on each, so I have to fix that.
Hey everyone, this is my presentation. Let's start it off. What did these three characters have in common? Aside from being horror movie protagonists. You can raise your hand, you can, yes, you in the back.
They're white.
Yes, that's not what I'm looking for though. You are correct.
They're the killers.
Also correct, not what I'm looking for.
They're all dudes.
Correct also. The thing I'm looking for is that these characters are all physically disabled. Freddy Krueger himself is a disfigured character. He has full body burns from being burned alive. Jason Voorhees is ambiguously deformed. It's implied to be a birth defect, but it's never explicitly stated. And John Kramer is wheelchair bound from, I believe, Saw 2 throughout his entire life. This also includes him post-mortem. But all of these characters are physically disabled. And that is important because all these characters are, in fact, as mentioned before, villains. This is a very prominent issue in horror movies, especially in the big boom of horror movies from early 70s to late 90s. And what is a disability in what I've discussed? I narrowed it down to 3 Ds that I've labeled disfigurements, deformities, and disabilities, parentheses physical. Disfigurements I qualified as injuries that often affect the majority of the body, so like chemical burns, radiation poisoning, limb amputation, burning, necrosis, things like that. And these happen suddenly and without warning. Deformities are disorders that affect most, if not all, of the body from birth, often caused by genetic issues. Down syndrome, spina bifida, acromegaly, large birthmarks, dwarfism, microcephaly are all good examples of this. And the last category is more of the catch-all. These are various visible disabilities that affect limited parts of the body. This can include limb reduction defects, clubbed foot, albinism, Lou Gehrig's disease like Stephen Hawking, paraplegia, which is wheelchair usage. And this also includes blindness, but blindness is not always visible, so I didn't list it on this category. And this is the pie chart that I chose. These are a tally of all of the horror movies that I saw with disabled characters as like main protagonists. Whether they are the antagonist, whether they are the hero of the story. I tallied all those up, and this is from about 1930 to the present day. 85 of these films had disabled villains that fell into one of these categories. About 37 had able-bodied villains that either had disabled victims or disabled like accomplices. And the appendix of films that I listed is on this QR code. If you scan it, you can look through all the films that I've tallied and find their names and the date that they were published. On that list, it is very obvious where there's a big boom, because there are a bunch of films that focus on things like facial scarring, focus on things like, oh, a deformed character or a deformed child is the main villain in this. Some of the most prominent examples that I saw was, aside from the main 3, a very famous movie called Eyes Without a Face. This film focuses on disfigurements, and the main character is not actually the disabled one. She fell into the the able-bodied villain category. She is the daughter of a surgeon who was in a car crash and lost her face. And the surgeon went a little crazy and started stealing other people's faces to try to graft onto her own. She was not a willing participant in this, and so she did not fall into the disabled villains category. There are other films that do play this kind of straight. A lot of films with the word wax in them happen to be those category, because usually they are either wax burn victims or fire burn victims that later go on to use wax in their products. And a lot of these are disfigurements because they all happen accidentally or as part of this big incident. Deformities were a little bit weirder because a lot of deformities aren't really seen in like adult characters. This is very common in something that is called womb horror colloquially. Womb horror is the fear of birthing something frightening or the fear of birthing something that is deformed. Good examples of this film, like genre, would be Eraserhead. Eraserhead's baby is not supposed to be like this alien. It's a child with clubfoot, which is a mere disorder that kind of bends in the legs. And the director of this film had a child with clubfoot and decided, I'm gonna represent this child as a skinless, like malformed infant. And this is going to be the main villain. The infant doesn't do anything aside from yell, aside from scream. And it drives people insane enough to the point to kill. Which is really crazy to say when you have a child who is disabled. So a lot of those films, like deformity films, focus on something is wrong with my child. I can't give birth to this child. This child's going to be deformed. They're going to be hated and unloved all their life. Which again is really crazy to say when you have deformed children or you know people with birth deformities. And then like latter category, disabled villains for just general disability. Those would be like wheelchair users. Honestly, I would have put Doctor Strange in this category had he been a villain, because his disability was him losing his hands. That is a big part of his body that like genuinely disabled him, couldn't let him work. But he became a protagonist, and so he didn't fall into this category, obviously. But a lot of these disabilities are seen as like points where this person became evil, or like the reason that they are evil in the disabled villain category. For able-bodied villains, a lot of those are harming people or working with people who are disabled in order to cause harm to more people. There is one film that was very, very early on, I think 1930, focused on a film of a man infecting people with acromegaly, which is a condition where your body does not stop growing. It creates like physical deformities similar to what you'd see in Frankenstein's monster, where like foreheads are tall, like teeth are small in the mouth, and everything just seems larger and more intimidating. And this doctor was doing it just for fun, just because he liked to see people suffer with this disability. Things like that, where an able-bodied villain targets someone in order to inflict a disability on them, also villainizes the disability by seeing it as like a punishment or some kind of way to keep that person under their thumb. Very prominent movie recently, Run, 2020, featuring one of the actresses from the famous horror movie TV show, American Horror Story. This actress, Sarah Paulson, was a character who lied to her daughter, who was not actually her real daughter died in childbirth, spoilers, and convinced her that she was disabled from birth. And in order to sell this lie, gave her pills that were not prescribed for humans that caused paralysis in the legs. And her daughter never recovered from this. Even though she began to recover some use of her legs, she remained disabled, which is not something that you'd see a lot in older films. A lot of the times, a disabled character in a film is either killed because they are villainous, or they are miraculously cured because they are heroic.
which is not how disabilities work. I should know. So, with all that being said, why does it matter? Simple. The stereotype of evil disabilities has deeply impacted how people with disabilities in real life are treated, and continues to do so. Even if you're not a horror fan, you probably know characters like Jason Voorhees, like Freddy Krueger, because they are so ingrained in like pop culture media. And honestly, I think I could look around this room and probably point at someone and they can name a horror villain that they've seen that falls into one of these categories. Any volunteers? Yeah, prevalence, as I mentioned before, huge spike from the early 70s to late 90s, but this actually became less prominent at the tail end of the 90s because slasher films like Scream or I Know What You Did Last Summer, or more present day examples, Thanksgiving or Founders Day, films like those, they focused on the killer could be anyone, meaning they can't be picked out in a crowd. People with physical disabilities who can't hide their disabilities are often easily able to be picked out in a crowd. And so the prevalence of a deformed villain or a disabled villain just completely dropped after about 1999. Which is very strange considering the impact that those films have not dropped since that time. People are still judging people based on looks alone. Even I myself am sometimes responsible for doing this. Sometimes I'll see someone with a birthmark on their face, or sometimes I'll see someone with a missing limb, and I cannot help the fact that I stare at them for a little bit. And I know that it's harmful, but because I've been raised on films like horror movies, I've been raised on films like thrillers, crimes, crime dramas, I have been getting this subconscious bias that disabilities, especially visible disabilities, are somehow wrong or evil. And it's been a really, really hard process to try to unlearn that, especially when you're little, and that is all you ever see. However, disabled characters, both actors and the characters themselves, are treated with more grace nowadays. Run actually was one of the most recent films that had an actual disabled actor playing a disabled character, and it is the first film in 70 years to have a wheelchair-bound actor. A lot of the time, yes?
Just fine, 5 minutes.
Oh,
Yep.
I thought you were raising your hand,
Nope,
sorry.
you're good. I know, I'm just trying to, you're good.
Wheelchair-bound actress, which is huge, especially because she is a very young actress. A lot of the times when a disability is portrayed in film, a lot of deformities are exaggerated because it's easy to fake that with special effects, same with disfigurements. A lot of the time CGI and practical effects are used to elevate that. And for disabilities, just generic disabilities, it's really easy to pretend to be a wheelchair user for a film. Especially because you don't really have to prove it to anyone. It's harder when you are an actual wheelchair user and you are not treated seriously because of this. Because people think, oh, you can walk around just fine. I've seen you walking before. You don't need a wheelchair. Walking wheelchair users do exist. They are able to walk around for short periods of time, and this is actually shown in the film Run. At the very end of the film, the protagonist is able to walk for short periods, but is still wheelchair bound. That is a very common reality for a lot of wheelchair users, and that leads to them not being taken seriously. Because when people see actors in films in wheelchairs, and see those same actors walking around with no problem, they think, oh, it must not be that important. It must not be that useful to them. And they don't really get proven otherwise unless they see someone who physically cannot move their legs. There's a lot more to do before we can say that we've undone the impact of these stereotypes, before we can say, oh yeah, people can look at someone else on the street, see something different, and not instinctively cringe away. this might be a like strange thing to say, but we can't just condemn these films. Like, we can still watch them, we can still like engage with them, but we should be aware about how they feed into these subconscious biases. Oh, I thought I had another slide. I apologize. So these subconscious biases can be undone. It takes time, it takes effort, and things that go against these biases, things that kind of reinforce them, will probably never go away. Because some of these films are 40 years old at this point, but they're still like being circulated. People still talk about Freddy Krueger's. People still talk about John Kramer, especially with the prevalence of sequels and spin-offs and prequels and other stories like that. These films will never truly die, but their impact can fade over time. And that's all. I put the video mute on, so
Perfect,
the
okay.
transition is a little smoother.